My consultancy is called the Sophia Consulting Firm. I founded it in New York City back in 2017. And it got fully operationalized in 2019 as a scientific communications consultancy. And so what I do really, I have a trademark on this, is amplifying scientific innovation. And that's by working with both emerging and established biotech companies globally. And the idea for that is, to integrate my background as a Yale-trained breast cancer research scientist, and to also elevate what we hear a lot of today. I think AI is such a buzzword, but it's also cautionary to people that are not paying attention, right? The cautionary warning to say, if you trivialize any type of innovation and you try to learn it too soon, too late, then the lessons you will pay for will come about a little sooner rather than later. But I think what probably drives me the most, and something I didn't hear in the few minutes or so that I was waiting for our panel to start, was what we're doing in terms of clinical trials in Africa. I think, that's a continent that sometimes doesn't get as much attention, but there's a lot of opportunity. 2% of clinical research dollars go to African countries, whereas when you think about the world disease burden, Africa showed us about 25% of that. So in some of my more recent work, I've tried to partner with organizations like Roche Africa to think about how we're using smartphone technology and just basic devices to provide patient-reported outcomes. And these are data that we need to see how our patients are responding on a daily level. And the whole phenomenon behind the future of healthcare really is about personalized therapy, right? So everything is getting personalized, from your Amazon recommendations to whatever it is that you do. Healthcare is not any different. And one of the themes that I explored in my podcast, which is also called Amplifying Scientific Innovation, the recent theme that I'm looking at, and my guest for that will be Sophia the robot. She's the first humanoid robot that was developed in Hong Kong by Hanson Robotics. It's around the responsible, ethical, and conscious use of AI. And I know as capitalists, we're more concerned about how we're scaling and growing from a commercial standpoint. But I think, especially when you think about the business of healthcare, because humans are involved, we owe it to ourselves to also think about the ethical implications, even from an AI perspective. So I'll be happy to share more about, my background, but it's always an honor to speak with other people. And I thank anyone that is listening to today's conversation. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophia. Then next we'll hear from Divya.
Sure. I'm Divya Yerraguntla. I've been part of healthcare for about 26 years. Worked with various companies, J&J for 6 years, Novo Nordisk for 10, Sun Pharma for 4, Syneos Health for 4, and now I'm with Treehill Partners. Okay, can you hear me? Okay.
Barely.
Okay. So I've been mostly involved in my career throughout the continuum of the assets, but mostly in late phase and commercialization. I have commercialized 32 products, 11 markets, 9 therapeutic areas. My first master's was in applied math. So it's very exciting to see AI come up. A lot of the things are coming back. So two of my passion areas, technology and healthcare, like this is the best time to be in this space. So super excited to be here. I am now part of Treehill Partners. What we look for is companies, transaction advisory, and also product development. So I do a lot of assessments for assets and portfolios. And that was also something I had done with my previous jobs, and look at end-to-end, all the way from clinical trials to commercialization.
Wonderful. Thank you. We'll be sure to touch on a lot of those topics. And our third panelist is Black.
Yes. Late addition. Pleasure to be here. Hope you can hear me all right. I'm with Martis Capital. We are a healthcare investment firm based in San Francisco and DC. We will complement, I think, the other two panelists nicely because we're mostly on the services side and healthcare technology. Although we do have a clinical research site network that does phase 1 through phase 4 clinical trials, with a specific focus on underrepresented patient populations in the US. So yes, you mentioned Africa. Obviously,
Hey, we still have people in the US. We could talk US data too.
Yeah, for sure. We invest typically as the first institutional capital to help a founder go through sort of a business with maybe 10 million of revenue to something that's significantly larger. And we help them around building out the management team, systems, processes, new markets, things like that. Yeah, and I head up the business development efforts.
Well, wonderful. This should be a really great panel. We have a PhD, someone on the PE side, and someone with deep experience as an operator. So why don't we kick this off with maybe a continuation of this last conversation that we had around AI, and specifically drill down into how AI is impacting healthcare and really what that means for investment opportunities in pharma and biotech. I don't know who wants to start that one.
Sure, I can start. So I think AI is everywhere, right? Everybody wants to know how can we use AI? And I think that's a great conversation because technology without a business problem is of no use, right? We have so many technologies that come and go, but what stays is that has solved the biggest business problem for us. And I think we have so many business problems in the healthcare side. I think there's no better way to look at it than see how AI can help us. And we've seen that in recent time, right? We have seen all the way from AI in the product discovery platforms, all the way going to tools, to maximum use right now in the latest studies, 26% of AI use is in radiology, clearly because it's more machine learning, because you can see all the scans, do quick, finding anomalies, and then at least not replacing the physician in my view, but really putting the most important cases up front so we can save the most critical lives first. So there is a lot happening from personalized medication to gene and cell therapy, all of the CRISPR technology. There is a lot of scope there. There is also a lot of scope for identifying target candidates on where we want to take the healthcare with. There is a lot of AI in mental health space, right? I can talk about data forever, but so much of the digital therapeutics also are working on the mental health space and how technology can enable some of the aspects where we do not have the therapeutics to keep in. So I think there's a lot of scope and a lot happening.
Sophia, would you like to chime in on this?
Yeah, I think AI, even when you think about healthcare delivery, right? Because we can look at it from end to end, the ability to optimize efficiency. So my background is a medicinal and natural product chemistry. So that's like the drug 101. What is the drug? What does it become? And in the past, if you think about the 1990s, we're talking about blockbuster drugs, right? The Lyricas, the Lipitor, the Viagras, that was what we had then. But today, again, as I mentioned earlier, the focus is on personalized medicine, and from drug discovery, AI is helping us to go through the drug screening process much quicker and much efficiently, go through previous drug libraries, drugs that have been approved before for an indication or another, and trying to find a new purpose, right? Because we have to think about cost efficiencies. While we, of course, have cell and gene therapies that are, $2 or $3 million per dose, and that's supposed to be a curative approach, that's few and far in between, right? So I think in terms of improving the patient experience, having cheaper drugs, it starts with the drug discovery process and how AI is aiding for us to get drugs quicker to approval, which of course will help to reduce the cost, because right now I think the data are, I would say there's like drug discovery is almost like a 90% failure rate, right? So I think what was the number? I think it keeps changing.
1 in 5,000. 1 in 5,000.
Right, because you have some people that even say it's 1 in 10,000, and I'm like, okay, that's a little bit more extreme. So I'd agree it's like 1 in 5,000 drugs make it through from the time you think about drug discovery to the time it ends up in a patient's medical cabinet or whatever the case might be. So that's a very high failure rate. That also contributes to the volatility of the industry and any type of hesitancy that investors would have, because it's like, if I'm investing my money, what are the chances? What is the probability of success? So I think, again, if we think about AI as a tool for improving that confidence, because if we can put out products that have the best chances for success, then that means you can recover any monies that you invested. And then on the other side, as we think about patient-centered care, one of the things that's interesting, and I know I gave an example about Africa, and I'll be interested to talking to you actually about the work you're doing here in the US, just on a separate note. But I used to live in Toledo, Ohio. I don't know if anybody has lived in Ohio over here. I assume no. But one of the things that is interesting about Lucas County, Ohio, is that as of 2006, they had a low birth weight rate of 17.5%. So roughly 1 in 5 women, and these are often, low socioeconomic status women, oftentimes African-American women, were having babies that were 5 pounds or less upon birth, which makes them obviously at risk for a whole bunch of diseases. So what we did then was to pair these women with community health workers. And that was a project that I set up when I was a master's in public health student back in Ohio. Almost 20 years later, what we're doing with that same project is to now empower women with the phones. Let's start the communication between you and your community health worker, you and your physician. How is the patient's heart rate? Let's, again, leverage what the patient is telling us through patient-reported outcomes to improve the patient experience. So AI is doing that for us as well. So there's so many ways that we can get into it. But I think an undercurrent theme for me is to understand that the purpose of technology is to improve what is existing. And when it comes to healthcare, I think speed is very important because speed can help to reduce some of those high cost of drugs that malign the reputation of the pharmaceutical industry, and will also improve investor confidence in saying, hey, I think we can now look at drug discovery as something that we should invest in. But at the same time, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we should keep thinking about ethical uses of AI, data privacy laws. Do we fully understand it? Are we paying attention to what people are consenting to? And do we really manage and protect the data that we're collecting? How do we make sense of all this information around us? So it's not obviously a simple topic, and it's not one that we will completely exhaust today. But I just think, again, the whole purpose of technology is to exist what we have, and through the improved speeds, we can reduce cost and improve investor confidence.
Yeah, thank you for the perspectives. I'm a little bit later in the stage as far as company development. So for us, when we think about investments in AI, it's very much enabling what we're already doing with our investments. And we often find, the previous panel mentioned that maybe there's a great medical case, but are the people in the field trained on the technology? Is the patient receptive to that as well? That's why maybe it's more around, like you said, medical imaging. Like we have a company, I don't know if you're familiar with, called HeartFlow. They basically, when you take an image of the heart through a CT scan, you can model it through a 3D sort of software by HeartFlow to see if there's any blockage in the heart, in the arteries. And that's now done 80% plus through AI to basically alleviate the need for a human, or you only kind of give the toughest cases. And the other thing we typically think about with these technologies is there going to be reimbursement on the other side, right? Because you often think, what a great potential, but yeah, somebody has to pay for it. That's something we're very focused on. And I think to date, at least, it skews more for venture investing. And when you think about sort of later stage, it's a little bit tougher. But I think it's more a matter of time than yes or no. It's just gradually and start initially less sort of patient facing and more over time.
Divya, earlier, isn't a lot of the low-hanging fruit in AI from diagnostics, and that's where you have the hardest time retrieving payback? Or, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, if you get cancer, insurance covers XYZ amount of it, right? But taking a test early doesn't necessarily get covered, right?
Well, I'd love to hear a perspective. So the company I mentioned, this is not an advertisement for this company. It's called HeartFlow. They're reimbursed by CMS, sort of Medicare, about $1,000 per exam, if you will.
Now, you have to be a Medicare patient.
Yes, you can otherwise pay, there's commercial coverage as well, but you have to have symptoms. So if I go, it's usually for elderly individuals. When the company started over about 15 years ago, obviously AI, maybe for some in the room, it was already a topic for me, and others maybe not, but the company did not rely on that initially, but it's just becoming more efficient. Its operating cost is coming down because it doesn't need that many people to read the images. So it's interesting that maybe new startups today, their reason to exist is because of AI, whereas maybe some that are more 10, 15 years ago, they're now just accelerating or getting more efficient because of AI. So I think your question is a good one, but often these technologies already exist a while ago. They may already have reimbursement because AI is more like a nice to have for them. But I'd love to hear first.
For the new companies, see, you can still get some reimbursement as long as you show impact, right? So there is something called budget impact models that we built to show to the payers to say, hey, by doing this upfront, you save this much money, because treatment for a patient down in the continuum is way more expensive than doing it upfront. Right? So if you can show that by doing this diagnostic, we can detect cancer, and again, you don't run diagnostics for everybody, right? High risk patients.
Right.
If you do it upfront, I'm actually going to find out something, and early detection leads to early diagnosis, leads to, early.
Which so like, since you mentioned cancer, I think the metric is that only 5% of people who should be getting early testing for cancer are getting it.
Exactly.
Right.
So now if there's an AI model that detects, and I'll give the breast example cancer because Dr. Sophia can talk to that. When you have dense breast, your probability of getting breast cancer is higher. But then we're not getting all of them into this program because it's expensive. But if we had a detection tool, if you have dense breast, you would go through that program and you will get early detection, which will help. So if I can sell this to the insurer to say, when they go for the regular mammogram, they see this, they should be doing this first as a first step, they will cover it. But you have to make the case for that. You have to have a good value proposition. You have to good budget impact model to show them how it's going to impact their budget by doing this. And you can get coverage. So it's not
you have to
impossible.
make a case.
You have to make a case, yeah.
And there's also oncology, obesity related oncology, right? Which with population that's always gaining weight, that becomes a big issue. So.
Wonderful. Well, Divya, you said something earlier. I'm sorry, Dr. Sophia, did you want to add in or?
No, I was going to say it's beyond obesity, actually. I think if you look at the mammogram screens, I'll probably say 1 in 10 women that get screened for mammogram might develop cancer in their lifetime. But if you break down the demographics of the population, you will see that Black women actually are dying faster from any type of cancer, including breast cancer, than any other ethnic group. And part of that are those social determinants of health. And so when I look at companies that are looking at underserved populations, you will see that much of the gap it's around awareness, around access, sometimes also around language, right? So a lot of Hispanic women might not find doctors that are also trained in English. We're talking about being trained in AI, but we're talking about basic language barriers. So there are challenges really. And so when people consent to something, they may not fully even understand what they're consenting to, which will lead to some kind of liability issues in the future, right? Because they can always claim like, oh, I had no idea that I consented to X, Y, or Z. So it's a complicated issue. And the comorbidities like obesity, I'm working with Roche Africa, and what's interesting is that trying to improve the breast cancer screenings. And they also looked at women to see an opportunity to track comorbidities, right? So diabetes and hypertension were two of the most that tracked with breast cancer. So when you're tracking information using AI for one thing, you can get information for the other. And before you know, you're reducing risk, not just for oncology, but also for cardiovascular health and such. So there's a lot of promise, but just too much confusion. If we look at it just from a commercialization standpoint, I don't think, and as we look at the shift towards value-based care versus fee-for-service, then we have to keep thinking about impact. And if impact is the case, then it makes it easier to draw that case, whether whomever the stakeholder might be, whether it's an investor or whether it's Medicare, just what is the value proposition of this new technology?
Divya, earlier you said something pretty intriguing. You said technology without a business problem has no use. And when we talk about AI and drug discovery, I think the failure rate that I heard was 1 in 5,000, right? Pretty low number. We're also hearing about detection, prevention, therapeutics, obviously drug discovery. As you think about the different areas discussed, maybe we haven't yet discussed, what do you anticipate where this kind of higher ROI, if you will, for lack of a better term, will be over the next few years?
Maybe use AI?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a great question, actually. There are many areas you can handle. Most of the startup companies that I speak to or advise, they're trying to kind of get into the data part because that's where AI shines, right? It can look at large amounts of data. You can put things in LLM, you can create a RAG very specific to your own domain and kind of put the data in and see how it answers. So it's not as biased as it might be. That's where they go for. But the biggest issue is data is great, but Epic owns the EHR space. They're already working on models to incorporate AI. So as a startup company, if you try to do that, I think the impact is less. The most impact right now will be if we can automate the back office functions, if we can alleviate healthcare professionals, their stress, their burnout, that's a low hanging fruit. So the most impact in the fastest way, with least impact to patient lives directly, but most efficient to get medications to the patient, if that makes sense.
Back office.
Back office, and like look at the workflows, try to work on that. And of course, drug discovery is a big area, because there we can actually see where we used to have experiments in a sequential fashion. You can literally now in microchips do 1,000 variations of dosage within minutes, and then come up with the best candidates, and kind of, so condensing a 6 month to a 12-month cycle into pretty much days and hours, which is significantly impactful, right? And at the end of the day, the product price is determined by all the money spent on the product, right? So if you're spending $1 billion in the research, somebody needs to pay, and that's where commercialization kicks in. You're not paying for the $2 capsule because it takes $2 to produce it, which is what everybody says. It's only $2 to produce. No, you're paying for that capsule and all the research and everything else that has gone in to get it to that capsule stage. By condensing these timelines, we are saving money, which means ultimately the cost of the drugs will come down if we do it the right way. And I think that's where the most impact would be.
Question from the audience?
Yes.
Anyone you guys know using AI, evaluating diet, lifestyle, environmental factors, correlation with prevalence of disease in different groups?
So we have had a discussion just on this Monday on that exact topic. The issue is not that we do not understand the correlations. The problem is the data. The data is so fragmented and it's not labeled. So getting all the data in the same format that AI models can look at it and get something meaningful does not exist right now. If we spend the time and money, we will be able to get there.
Did you make the observation, maybe it was a year ago, that all the different devices that people use to record activity give different measurements on different parts of the body?
I did. Good, you
I listened.
remember.
Yeah.
You do listen. Yeah,
Amazon
thank
or
you, Marty.
Facebook do it? Like how often do you go to the gym, or how often do you buy Fruit Loops, or how?
It won't measure
it's sort
your
of-
pulse rate or things like that.
But
No.
that's sort of after the fact. I'm just thinking leading indicator.
We
Well-
have another question here in the room.
Yeah, so I've actually worked on something for like about years. A friend of mine is a doctor. It was like a big data play where you basically would input all of your data, input all of your data in there to a system, and then you're able to monetize it because you sell your data basically to a CRO or to any of these, clinical labs. So you have a wallet that would help you subsidize your healthcare costs. And so one of the big issues, and there was Practice Fusion that was funded about like 8 years ago, and that actually got more money than it actually was sold for, is that you have to, one, I think, have the different collectors of data all want to put it into one system. So that's one of the things. That was the big issue with Practice Fusion. But two, like it's a multi-billion-dollar business now with healthcare data. And so there's like companies that scrub all the ICD codes and everything. And so one of the biggest issues is that you can collect all the objective data, and you have to assume that everybody's want to put it all into one platform. But what's really, really meaningful is the subjective data. Like, did you take your pill this morning? Did you go buy Fruit Loops, or did you buy like the Wheat Thins? You know what I mean? Like it's that kind of stuff that's like really powerful stuff, because a lot of the healthcare data that you get that's coded, it's actually pretty bad as it is. So the question is, and then how do you incentivize somebody to actually put in accurate data, right? And to test that. So one of the thought is to do this wallet. It's still a decent idea, but it's a question of that data would be so powerful, especially across different ethnic and racial groups. It's easier to do in countries where there's like a one healthcare government system because you mandate it, or frankly, if you do it in refugee camps, but it's harder in this country.
One other comment I would add is to what you were saying. The one way we could do it, like kind of incorporate everything, is even though they are in different formats. Let's say you have an app, you register everything you eat, right? Like a Noom, for example, you register everything in it. If there's a capability to get your blood work into the same app, and then somehow it translates because we know that format. So you need to do some translation. And if I can actually put in what my ethnic background is, because again, AI needs to slice by ethnic background, sometimes geography. My water content may have more iron than others. And then what I'm eating, how I am behaving, and have my reports pulled into it, and then at least give me some basic information on, okay, you're low on vitamin K based on your blood report, and you're not eating any spinach. You need to add more spinach to your, because it knows what I'm eating. There needs to be some kind of a coordination. So AI can do that. I think it's a billion dollar app, and I'll take my royalties, whoever does it. But if that's done the right way, we can get there. And it's not going to be comprehensive of everything, because again, even now in some states, you can get your own data out of your EHR system. Some states mandate it, like California, others don't. So it's like to do it universally, you can boil the little lake first and then try to get to the ocean.
You can imagine Amazon could do it, right? They got Amazon, they got Whole Foods, what are you ordering, what are you
All their
buying? And
companies.
they got the pharmacy too, so what drugs are you buying? So all of a sudden,
But do you want them to own your data?
no, I didn't even give them permission, they could do it with what they have.
Yeah, well,
Because they're
that's the
doing
issue.
everything on the companies they own. All of them are on the same system or similar systems which are talking to each other. So interoperability is extensively important in this space, right? Because if they're not talking in the right sense, they're not telling, I may call your blood pressure B and my system may call it A. As long as the translation is happening at the right level, we know it's the same person and that's the blood pressure. If not, everything's wacky, and in healthcare, you can't take the risk. Has to be validated. So interoperability and then validation kind of prohibit that.
Dr. Sophia, maybe we can hear from you. What are your views on the areas of AI and healthcare that you anticipate will do well over the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously not because my background is in oncology, but cancer is the second leading cause of death in the US. And cancer is such a heterogeneous disease. There's so many different types of cancers, both solid tumors and blood cancers, right? So there's a lot of room for growth in terms of how, if we focus on the end product, meaning just the patient side. I've already talked about the drug discovery side and the role that AI can play. But, you know, if you think about the healthcare market, I will probably say roughly 40% of the dollars go towards oncology. Again, not just because we have the specialists, but we have people that are willing to pay. And if it's classic economics that we're looking at, then, you know, willingness to pay is going to be the most important criteria. So people will pay if they see results, they see impact. And so AI will play a role. I would say the biggest role is probably around what we've been discussing. And I think, you know, patient-reported outcomes. If I look at that 5 different criteria for looking at the patient-reported outcomes, but similar to what we were saying, it's the patient experience that we're trying to pinpoint. We're trying to pinpoint that patient journey mapping, like understanding why do you choose, you know, metformin, for example, versus Juvederm? What is the reason behind that? How is patient adherence? So how are you sticking to the same prescription? Like, how are you monitoring yourself and reporting that? I like that idea of the patient-reported outcomes because it's less formulaic. It's more about understanding those fine lines and what patients are looking for. So if I think technologically, if I look at just all the diseases at large, I think the demand for a better patient experience, the shift towards value-based care, and you see all these different surveys you get now anytime you go to a hospital, is going to really dictate that we pay attention to the patient experience and what patients are monitoring and reporting with their phones. We have digital clinical trials now, and this was something that started during COVID-19. You had the FDA for the first time in centuries. Yes, I said centuries. The FDA for the first time in centuries is just making changes, trying to expedite how long it takes to approve a new drug, and how are we leveraging technology itself from a regulatory standpoint to improve the drug discovery process. I like that because that's an aspect we don't really talk about, or else we have some FDA types in the room, but there's also technological innovation going in in terms of how we approve drugs. So therapeutic area, oncology is probably a very ripe and promising area just because of the heterogeneity of the disease. I understand, of course, we talked about heart flow, cardiovascular disease is still number one. So there's plenty of room for growth and tracking from that perspective. If we look at large from a systems perspective, then as we look towards value-based care, we're going to be relying on AI to help us communicate the patient-reported outcomes, hopefully in real time with people's doctors so that they're saying, hey, okay, how is my patient doing? How are they improving? And we have all this information in front of us. And then from a regulatory standpoint, which is for me the third layer, helping us to get drugs approved quicker, reducing some of the bureaucracy that has been in the way in terms of how we approve drugs, not just in the US, but hopefully worldwide. I hope that's helpful.
It is, thank you. Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead, Rick.
I was just hoping that we can get some more like other perspective on low hanging fruit outside of back office. And also, one of the reasons people have said, we want to do better on diagnostics because a lot of diagnostics have such high rates of false positives, they might actually scare people from taking them. So I thought that might be an interesting place where AI would come into play because it would hopefully reduce the false positives. So I think you were talking about density on breast exams, things like that. So, more thoughts on low hanging fruit outside of, bureaucracy?
Oh, go ahead.
I can give one example, as Dr. Sophia mentioned, FDA, right? FDA, when you prepare, you have to prepare all these documents, right? All the way from your animal studies, all the way to your phase 3 studies. It takes a good 6 to 8 months for the team to pull it together, right? Before you file for your NDA or a BLA to get your product approved. Now they have AI companies where they're at least just pulling together the template takes a month, right? Because you need to look at all this data. You have to look at the format. FDA needs it in a specific format. Now there are companies that will actually do it overnight for you. It will give you 80% of the template. It will digest all of your data, your specific clinical data. It will go through the template format for FDA, and at least it will get you to a good start. So now we are able to do this within a month or 2 months. All you need to do is, and these experts cost a lot of money, the biostatisticians and everybody, for them to sit and do all of this work. Sometimes it's easier for it to be done, at least upfront. Now they're checking the work. They're looking, the story is in line with what they want the product, we have target profiles. If it's aligned with the target profiles, and then it kind of goes forward. So I think that's a low-hanging fruit, right? It's a back office function, but critically important. And it also will give you references. Again, we used to have like 4 or 5 people just sitting and building the references. Where is this coming from? Because God forbid, if you have to go into an ad board with FDA, they ask you questions, you have to answer within minutes and pull slides up. And those are usually 2,000 to 3,000 slide decks, right? You need to know exactly where that information is. And AI can help us do all of that in a very efficient manner and get us to where we need really quickly and more accurately, because now you're not dealing with 10 humans and their errors.
Well, maybe we pivot and play with this theme a little bit and go back to the finance perspective with Vladimir. What are the areas that you're seeing the most activity in terms of deal pipeline and on the deal side and the deals you're looking at?
Yeah, hope to share with the fellow panelists too, but I'd say in the middle market where we spend time, there's a lot of, about 2/3 of what we do is in healthcare services and care delivery, which includes also outsourced pharma services. So I'd point out a couple areas, maybe we can have a conversation, but I already heard value-based care, and we could certainly talk about that. For me, a little bit, the way we think about it is, and we have an investment in this, is a partnership with primary care physicians that are today fee for service, so paid for volume, like most of us probably go to our physician, to transition those to outcome-based delivery. So you get rewarded and paid for reducing downstream referrals and higher cost follow-up sort of procedures. So the way private equity would often play this strategy is it's called roll-up. So you might find my practice, then you can add others to it, and we could talk about regulatory concerns with that, and we've gotten some of that. But at the end of the day, we haven't so far discussed it, but healthcare in the US is highly, highly fragmented. It's a $4.5 trillion economy, so 18% of the US GDP. It's highly local, which is great for investors, right? You can have a value-based care business in one market that's very different from another. We've chosen the rural Southwest, unlike the Southeast, but in Florida, a lot of the providers are there in Florida. that you may have heard of, but there's just a lot of competition. So that's one area that we're spending some time in, and others as well. Happy to also talk about behavioral health. Years ago, we invested in an autism services provider, so treating kids with autism. During COVID, that one got a little bit of a tougher sort of sledding because of the, sending a provider into the home was challenging. But those have started to come back, so we're evaluating that as well. But there's also other types of mental health, like opioid addiction or mental health sort of conditions that investors in general like them because there's a lot of demand for those. There's a little bit of a shortage of providers. So if you're an investor, we haven't talked about it so far, so it's a good pivot, I think, because when we think about investing in a business that's looking to double or triple, we know that the demand is there, but can you provide the caregivers to really deliver the care? And on a spreadsheet, it often makes sense, right? Here's your 2 times, here's your 3 times, but can you recruit, can you retain? Turnover, that's a real issue. So maybe we can talk about, I don't want to just keep going.
Please, yes, please do.
Those are a couple areas. I don't know if you have any reactions to behavioral health care or anything like that.
That's the easy one right now with the technology aspect, right? Because
Remote, yeah.
remote, because a lot of people, again, there's a stigma associated. People still don't want to talk about it. If you give them an app and say, just try it out. And if you feel this way, why don't you look at it? So self-administration of such an app is easier because there are less restrictions there. And the scope is also good because for the physicians also, to your point, there are less mental health care workers in this country can deal with the patient population. And again, this is just diagnosed population we're talking about. There's so many more who are undiagnosed. So I think for the undiagnosed, at least getting them something that they can do on their own. For the diagnosed, having physicians or their caregivers be able to help them with a little bit technology-enabled solutions, I think helps. And I know somebody who has a company that actually deals with pain through an app, and it generates music, and they work with these therapists, they work with musicologists, and they've built this app. It's doing very well. It's in Europe though right now, but it's doing very well. So there is a lot of scope to do things which are non-interventional, as a first step.
Lovely, wonderful. So maybe we can move on to a topic that I think that each of the 3 of you will add something unique and maybe a little different. But it's the
actually did have a
topic of
question
asset.
for Vlad. I had a question for Vladimir.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is, so I own a medical practice, right? It's my partner, she's a doctor, it's concierge, right? And we're seeing more and more doctors become concierge, whether they're oncologists or they're taking care of people with heart disease, whatever they are. Because it's easier to have, 300, 400 patients who want you around the clock than to have thousands of patients and just being referred to all the time, right? And actually, a lot of people will pay if they've had a heart attack to have a doctor on call, right? So where do you see that trend going? And it seems to me like maybe you're playing more on the side of the mass care than of the specialized, this concierge division that's occurring.
Yeah, there's a place for all. There's One Medical as well. I mean, there's a little bit of a tiering.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
There's one, I think in the Bay Area and a few other parts of the country called Private Medical. Jordan Schlane was one of our LPs, little advertisement. I think we looked at that space a few years ago, and it was a little bit of a question of how can you ultimately scale these? Because if you're not in the big MSAs with a lot of wealth, are these just limited to those? And for us, we haven't talked also about it, but we, at some point, hopefully before we wrap, we'd love to talk about impact. It's implicit in a lot of what we talk, but maybe explicitly, I think primary care in a rural setting for us aligns better from a mission and impact standpoint. It's basically an access point in the care system. Concierge medicine is probably better objectively speaking, because you get better outcomes, better care, but it caters to a narrower socioeconomic demographic. So if there's an unlimited resource to go after or with to tackle problems, you probably do them all. But we try to have the greatest impact with the lowest sort of input into those issues. So I think primary care, because of the downstream referrals and everything.
So this is through the lens of underrepresented communities.
Yeah, just rural. They don't really have a hospital within 50 miles. So when we develop value-based primary care, that really strengthens the relationship of the primary care provider with their patients. The only knock-on effect you have to think about is that because you have to see fewer patients, right? You have to then get more providers.
Are these like traveling doctors, or do you do that as
These
well?
are-
or-
At times, but most of them just have a clinic. It's just that it's typically one or two in town. And so the whole point is that you can be more of a one-stop shop for these individuals. It's almost concierge, but light.
Do you see you doing more telehealth
Yeah.
in that
Yes.
scenario?
Yes.
Yeah, that makes
Yes.
sense.
Yep.
Look, I mean, we've done a lot of work with Accelerant Ventures out of Arizona. And one of the founders was a guy who kind of started these practices in the Native American community, where he's done work with, 20 different tribes, helping them establish healthcare practices and
Yeah.
facilities and recruiting doctors to go and service those communities as well.
Yeah,
It's
very interesting. Maureen, please.
Yeah, so you were mentioning that in the Native American communities in the Southwest, also in Alaska, the largest operator of the healthcare system up there are the Native tribes in Alaska. Whereas I think it's different in the Southwest. I don't think the natives or the Native Americans own their healthcare system, and I wonder, I don't know if you have a perspective of that. They don't actually. They're owned by someone else. But in Alaska, I know the Native Americans actually run their own healthcare system, and it's better.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
I think it depends on the tribe.
Yeah. So I'd like to ask each of you a question around critical factors for successful asset commercialization, right? So kind of like, what's your playbook? Obviously, we have 3 different areas of healthcare represented here on the panel, but what is that path forward for you when you're thinking about the critical factors for successful asset commercialization? Yeah.
For me, planning. You have to think with the end in mind, right? It's like the GPS. You put the address and then it'll give you a couple of paths. You decide which one makes the best sense. But you need to know where you're going. In this case, for commercialization, you need to know what market you're going to launch into, what will that strategy look like, and will you get covered, right? That brings me to my next major part is, how is that market access going to look like, right? Is it going to be self-pay? Am I going to get into a formulary? How many rebates do I need to give, which will impact my GTM, right? Which is pretty much my revenue. That part, extremely, extremely important. If you don't think you're going to get coverage, I won't even waste my time doing anything more. The third piece would be the science piece of it, right? Like, how good is my science where I can go to commercialization and say, even though like Lipitor, I think was mentioned, right? 6th to market, but the commercialization strategy was so good, it's the leader, right? So you can be the leader as long as you understand where you stand and you're able to commercialize it the best way possible. So having that strategy in place, having all those pillars, we look at it as 7 pillars for commercialization, right? So we have regulatory pathways, we have the product supply. Do you have supply enough to meet the demands? Then you have the organizational readiness. Do you have enough people, right, to work in the right skill set? Marketing, medical affairs, market access. So you need to have all these planned and lined, and that's how you really ace your commercialization.
Lovely. Dr. Sophia, what are your thoughts on successful asset commercialization?
Yeah, so for me, one of the questions I've asked all 64 of my guests on my podcast, Amplifying Scientific Innovation, is what is your definition of scientific innovation? And funny enough, everybody gave me a different answer. But for me, the bottom line is what makes healthcare different from any other space is that we're all patients or caregivers at any cost in our lifetime. And so for us to deprioritize or not pay attention to healthcare or to look at it from a pure numerical standpoint, it's not enough. I think we have to put the human standpoint. And there's, to me, one of the best parts about value-based care is that we care more about that patient experience and whatever way that we can use to get more information from patients so that we can design therapies that are targeted for them, personalized for them, and to improve clinical trial diversity, the information that we're feeding any computer, any technology, including AI, where are the data coming from? If we continue to have biases within the system, then whatever you put in is whatever you're going to put out. So I think that the third part about that, in addition to think about what is the innovation, basically what is the value proposition of anything you're doing, what is its impact from a patient perspective is, how does this tie in when you think about sustainability, this is not one and done, right? So even when we're talking about concierge services here in California, Hug, one of the big healthcare systems around here, they have their concierge services, but they also don't market that as much because they don't want to be seen as elitist, right? So we live in a society where there are still people that are struggling to survive, to get basic access to healthcare, a primary care physician. So I think, you know, we are all different stages of privilege, but that's why I think it's important when you think about healthcare, it's not a pure numbers game, it's a humanity game. And the best way to approach it is to keep in mind that at any point in your own life, and we learned this during COVID, right? You can be a patient. So think critically about how technology is going to improve, fine-tune the value proposition, and most importantly, I wouldn't have a trademark for amplifying scientific innovation if I don't showcase the importance of the publications, right? How do you credential the work? You have to put it out there, whether it's congresses, whether it's white papers, peer-reviewed articles, even a LinkedIn post. If you care enough about any type of innovation, don't underestimate the power of a single voice. I think many people who have been passionate about things have made a lot happen. And when you have the resources, think too about the human aspect, not just financially, because again, we're all patients or caregivers in our lifetime.
Well, thank you for that poignant reminder, Dr. Sophia. It's well received over here. Vladimir, maybe from your perspective as a PE firm, could you walk us through what that kind of playbook looks like for Martis to ensure successful execution and commercialization?
Yeah, I'll probably complement what my panelists already contributed more from a scientific and clinical side, a little bit from a, if you're an investor standpoint, how you can actually diversify some of that risk. The 1 in 5,000 is not great odds. So what we did 3 years ago, it's a new area of focus within private equities, helping build clinical research site networks. There's about 3,000 plus minus independent clinical research site in the US, so another highly fragmented end market, which immediately screams ripe for consolidation. 3 years ago, there were very few players. Today, there's several dozen. So what Alcanza, which is our partnership, does, and this is one of the success factors, I think, is the recruitment part of it, finding the patients, specifically the underrepresented patient populations. Typically, you think about how channels to get in front of these individuals, and often they might be less obvious, like you can go through the church communities or other sort of social channels that maybe not the most, like an email or a flyer, just because these populations act differently. And again, from an investment standpoint, it's interesting because you're really not putting your eggs in one basket with one drug. You actually are working with all the big pharma companies, regardless of what commercial plans they have, because you're really paid by the individual that you recruit for the study. So I'm just presenting an alternative view to the purely altruistic sense of how do you get something to commercialization, which is that how can you play that theme from an investment lens that's a little bit lower risk, right? Because if you just bet on a single drug, there's a great outcome, a great potential upside, but there's also so many that the odds are so low. Our approach is, let's kind of zoom out, let's be a partner to these big pharma companies, be a Switzerland to them, and benefit from the overall increase in R&D for new drug development. So that's a little bit how, more like a private equity firm.
Do you all, just a question.
Yeah.
Do you also look at it like diversification as investing in different types of therapeutic companies and then also different phases, right?
Exactly.
Some
It's like a
phase
matrix.
three,
Yeah. So
It's a
phase
matrix,
1 through 4,
yeah.
we have a fair bit of CNS, so the central nervous system trials. We have diabetes, oncology. So some studies pay higher stipends than others.
Right.
Some are just tougher to recruit for. So we're building a portfolio. We have about 34 sites today. And so it's growing nicely. And the biggest headwind has been, frankly, just making sure you continue to recruit the right way. Because the studies, there's always new studies. And there's one just factor that I'll throw out here is typically we read that for one blockbuster drug to make it through commercialization, you have to work with about 1,000 sites, which I couldn't believe. Mm-hmm. Because they're so small at the end of the day in terms of, and so our 34 is just a small fraction of that, but it just shows that the TAM is quite big.
But it depends on the therapeutic area. And I think to your point, the biggest challenge in clinical trials is recruitment. Biggest challenge. And now with all of this, the Orphan Drug Act coming into effect, you get a lot of expedited approvals and stuff like that for orphan diseases. So the research dollars are going up in that space. finding patients for orphan diseases is very hard because they're very far and few in between. So most of the times, having worked in a CRO myself, we would actually go to a network instead of trying to go side by side by side. If you have a network, you kind of get a warehouse of patients. So you can say this type of patients, you run your data and you say, okay, out of my network, I have 50 patients. Every patient helps because sometimes in this study, you may only need 12 patients. So, it's important. So I think, yeah, that's one strategy a lot of CROs use to get to patients faster and recruit faster.
What are some of the large macro themes that you're seeing and will continue to pay attention to, not only through the end of this year, but looking forward into 2025?
So I put some numbers which I thought were very interesting, right? So first one was AI drug discovery, definitely a lot happening. Zyra Therapeutics, based in San Francisco, got over $1 billion in CDC funding. Clearly, huge area of interest. So we will see a lot more AI coming into healthcare and investments going up there. Second piece was definitely in healthcare focused investments. We did see a lot of funds starting to show up, almost $2.9 billion just in Q1 alone. And that has been going on consistently. So there are funds, even though biotech companies are underfunded, which means eventually, possibly after JPM, we'll see a lot more activity and funding should come up, which is great news. Third metric, which I thought was very interesting, is 13.7 billion in funding for secondary phases, which tells me there is more emphasis towards commercialization now. A lot more funding coming in cities A, B, and C, because now they're getting closer. They want to have that commercialization focus on these assets to make sure they succeed in the market. So if we have early stage companies may not get as much funding as a little bit later phase.
Can you repeat that number?
13.7 billion. So I think that shows us that if you have a company, make sure that you're able to, however you can, get to a little bit later phase. If you are preclinical, get to the clinical stage. That is where the funding will flow rather than trying to do a fundraise at a preclinical stage. I think that would be more helpful for these companies trying to get money.
Fascinating data. Thank you, Divya. Dr. Sophia, how about yourself? What are the large macro themes that are top of mind for you?
Yeah, I think I alluded to it earlier. The one thing I don't think we've talked about at all is cybersecurity. I think we've mentioned it in passing, but if you're not paying attention to that, then I think everything else is defeated, because as much as we're getting data, we have to protect the data, access to data, all that good stuff. So I think a lot of startups sometimes underestimate why they need to invest in cybersecurity software and things of that nature. So I wanted to mention that. The two other areas, and they both have markets that are in the, like, I think if I remember correctly from a study that I saw previously, the two biggest markets when you think about healthcare is how are we going to integrate telemedicine and virtual healthcare services together? And that was probably the biggest lesson learned from COVID-19 is that you don't need to physically go to your doctor's office to have access to them. We talked about mental health earlier. When you think about the way that the World Health Organization defines health, it is physical, mental, and social well-being. So this idea of holistic healthcare is something that we're hearing about. We also talked about value-based care. So the market for telemedicine is projected to go up to roughly $273 billion by 2027. And so that's, again, probably the biggest thing that came out from COVID. And the CAGR is roughly 20% over a forecast period between 2021 and 2027. And this was a study that was published in marketresearch.com. But the bottom line is telemedicine and virtual healthcare, we had to pay attention to that. We also talked about AI and a little bit around machine learning. Think about what GE as a healthcare company is able to do in terms of even conducting ultrasound scans that can identify very early on the signs of heart failure. And for anybody that knows anything about heart failure, that the difference between surviving is sometimes a matter of seconds, right? So to think about the type of software that can increase our chances of diagnosis is something that we need to talk about. So the AI healthcare market itself is going to grow. I think the numbers that I have here is like $120 billion by 2027. So if you think about those three things, cybersecurity, virtual healthcare, telemedicine, AI, machine learning, and then the sandwich for all of that is the cybersecurity, investing in that proactively and bringing in the experts. The good thing about all of us here is that at some point in your career, you realize you don't have to be good at everything. So bring in the people that are good to support you, because no matter how good your program is, without the right cybersecurity protection, you're going to be very vulnerable. So those are my pieces.
How will people handle this demand for services that's going to pop up as a result of AI and all these new applications? I mean, you know.
Yeah.
So
You're seeing
it's
more nurse
current-
practitioners, right?
Yeah.
More nurse practitioners, more allied health professionals. So the switch away from the traditional medical doctor, MD, DO, and thinking about the primary care physicians, physician assistants. People don't necessarily need to have, you know, all these degrees to provide care. So I think we're being more nuanced in our approach, where you will see the expert when you need to, but in between that, you also have AI. There's a company I was working with that is leveraging AI so that, you know, patients are actually talking to somebody. It's not a real human, but it's $20 per session. And if you're willing to pay a little bit less, then you can have an AI vision in front of you, and they can help get our information and then escalate that to whomever else that is needed to. So I think we have to be open-minded to non-MD, DO types providing that type of care.
I've been told that nurse practitioner schools are becoming as selective as med schools.
Yeah, it's hard to get in now.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so Sophia, nurse practitioner schools are becoming as hard to get into as med
Oh
schools.
yeah, it's getting more and more, because I think a lot of nurses, they're also realizing if they can get a master's degree, I mean, they can make a lot more money and have a lot more power. So I think that we're going to see a lot of changes within our system. The biggest word is probably around flexibility. And if we want to see change in any way, flexibility is the key to that.
Yeah, Vlad, how about yourself?
Sure. I was gonna compliment, and you mentioned a few things that are top of mind as well. A lot of what we invest in has labor, and COVID was obviously a very tough time. Since then, it's improved, but there's still, actually, just because before walking over here, I was telling Max I was on an investment committee call with our firm when we were discussing an investment in a company that augments skilled nursing facilities with outside sort of labor. And one of our partners said, well, isn't this affecting the staffing business? So it is. So staffing, I think, is a bit of a trend / labor in healthcare that it kind of ebbs and flows. At times it's highly acute, sometimes it's less. Now it's probably somewhere in the middle. The autism investment I mentioned earlier as well, like it's a big deal how you staff these behavioral health technicians with the kids. So that's a trend in the 25, we think, for investors to navigate. And also, if you want to counterbalance that with more technology or software investments in your portfolio, because they're less dependent on people, that's something we would sort of evaluate. And maybe a cross section between everything we said is we talked about commercialization and drugs and discovery. Another area of investment for private equity is pharma tech. So technologies that basically enable, you mentioned market access, market comms, those are all, so leveraging technology to improve the drug commercialization process as well. Those are themes. And then the last one I was going to say is just to make, you know, a plug for the SEC or FTC. There's this concern about market power because of private equity rolling up some industries. Obviously, I think it's more because it can be politicized, right? And people are saying what will happen after November. But I think the reality is a lot of these industries are highly unsophisticated today, and professionalization, even though private equity is taking out some costs maybe from the system by optimizing, I think ultimately lowering costs, improving outcomes, that's what we should be measured by. And then in the meantime, there may be some wrinkles here and there, but I think the other trend I was just going to say was just watching the regulatory landscape into 25.
We didn't even discuss the aging population.
Yeah, that's just there.
Okay, about 2 more minutes.
I think aging population comes especially in effect because now we have a lot of CNS work happening. And the potential for that is projected to be $500 billion by 2028, only because we have so much now research dollars going into that field. Despite that clinical trials are long, require a lot more patients than other areas because of the aging population. Our population is heading that way. We have more patients coming into this space, so we need to be researching more, getting ahead of the game. So I think that's,
Well, it gets back to the bodies game.
Yeah.
Which is that you have all these people aging, are there enough people to take care of them? So I'm not sure, maybe Japanese robots, I don't know if you guys are invested in that kind of stuff either.
Also, the immigration policies are not super favorable. We looked at a staffing business that was importing basically from the Philippines, nurses, but
Sure,
it's not
okay.
easy actually. It's not, again, it's, you look at a textbook or the spreadsheet and it should work, but there's a lot of regulation, there's government. So bringing from outside the US may help the US, but then it makes it harder in those regions for them. But yes, that's.
But a lot of the immigration actually has been, in New York City at least,
Yes.
has been very negative for the hospital systems,
Yeah.
right?
For sure.
Because a lot of people go to the hospital, they don't see doctors,
Mhm.
and they go to the hospital when there's an emergency. And that just drives up, and these are always unpaid bills, and, you know, after, in 2008, several hospital systems had to shut down because bills weren't getting paid,
Mhm.
so.
Well,
But,
September is Healthy Aging Month, so we have 12 more days to remember that.
Fantastic.
All right, well, let's hear it for the panelists. Thank you all very much for your time and insight.
Oh, there's some bills.
Great job and very thought provoking.
Thank you. I'm gonna leave now. Thank you all.